Thank you to everybody for joining today for this webinar on the notice of proposed rulemaking. A lot of content for us to unpack here, and certainly look forward to discussing all the provisions of this rule. My name is Andy Lawton, I'm the Program Director of Natural Gas at Pond & Company. I've been involved with distribution natural gas projects for about 15 years and a lot of main replacement programs and DIMP evaluations and other types of elements that are going to be heavily impacted by a rule like this. So we look forward to kind of talking through all this as we go. Would ask folks to please put any questions or comments you have in the chat as we go through here. I will try to answer those as we get to the end of the presentation. But certainly appreciate everyone's interest in this topic that could have some pretty major ramifications to the natural gas industry. So again, we're here today to talk about a notice of proposed rulemaking. So not officially in place yet, but PHMSA has notified that changes are coming. This is being referred to by a lot of different names at this point. So you'll hear folks calling it the Safety of Gas Distribution Pipelines, SGDP rule, potentially DIMP 2, potentially the Merrimack Valley rule. A lot of different names for the same thing, which is really just new regulations relating to distribution integrity of natural gas pipelines. So if you're interested in reading the full rulemaking on this, you can look that up by this RIN number below, the 2137-AF53, 250 pages of light reading for you there. But my intent today is to summarize a lot of those relevant considerations, make that a little bit more digestible. So with that, how did we get here to this point? What was kind of the driving factor behind this notice of rulemaking? And I think most folks in the natural gas industry probably remember where they were on that September day in 2018 when the Merrimack Valley incident in Massachusetts occurred. Basically an overpressurization of low pressure gas lines that led to 1 fatality, 20 hospitalizations, damage to 130 structures, and an evacuation order for 50,000 residents. PHMSA has estimated that the impact of that incident was over $1.7 billion. Certainly, it's hard to put a price on someone's life or impacts to property, just impacts to folks' everyday lives. So, certainly keeping that in consideration as well. But a major incident for the distribution gas industry. And if you're not familiar with that incident and kind of what occurred there, the utility was in the midst of a major pipeline replacement program, similar to a lot of other utilities, replacing old cast iron infrastructure with new plastic pipelines. And they went through one of their particular projects, got the construction on that new pipeline to about 90% complete. And then the city that they were working in issued a moratorium on any new construction for utilities. So they were not able to complete the project at that point. I had to put it on hold without actually finalizing. Then came back probably a year and a half later to tie that pipeline in. And when they made the tie-in to the new plastic pipeline, what the folks there failed to realize was that the district regulator station, kind of in the vicinity of that tie-in that fed the old line and was now going to feed the new line, had some underground control or sensing lines, basically that were telling the regulator what kind of pressure to pass downstream. And those underground control lines were still tied to the old out of service pipeline. They were never appropriately moved to the new pipeline. So once that swap over was made, those control lines were not sensing any pressure, obviously, with the old line out of service, which caused the regulators to open to their widest position, passing the maximum amount of gas through and overpressurizing the downstream system, to which obviously the downstream appliances were not able to handle, resulting in explosions and other impacts that caused the damage that I mentioned above. So Certainly a lot of factors go into an incident like that. The NTSB report on that incident listed a specific cause as, quote, weak engineering management that failed to adequately plan and oversee a cast iron main replacement project, which is a pretty sobering statement for those of us on the engineering side of things to kind of hear it described that way. A contributing factor that they listed was a lack of adequate overpressure protection, which we'll be talking a lot about as part of this rule, and a perceived failure of their distribution integrity management plan, or their DIMP. So, that Merrimack Valley incident certainly a driving force behind a lot of the regulations that we'll discuss here. Another incident that PHMSA mentioned as part of this rulemaking happened in February of 2018, some leaks and explosions in Dallas, Texas. That operator's DIMP plan met all of the current requirements that are currently on the books. However, those incidents still occurred, and PHMSA notated specifically that age of pipe was not specifically considered as a risk factor in their DIMP plan, was not required to be at that time, but they did not consider that, and then PHMSA considered that a specific cause of those incidents. That is something that they're addressing as part of this rule as well. So those are kind of the incidents that, drove this rulemaking, the regulatory history of kind of how we got to this point as well. Just some background for you guys. So it's kind of started in 2009 when PHMSA issued their Pipeline Safety Integrity Management Program for gas distribution pipelines, which is a mouthful, but effectively created all of the DIMP requirements in Part 192, Subpart P. So that was kind of a landmark, change there, specifically putting DIMP programs in place, all the evaluation and record keeping that goes along with that. 2 years later, in 2011, the U.S. Secretary of Transportation Office announced a pipeline safety action plan, which basically allowed them to put some things in place for federal and state cooperation for accelerated repair and replacement of old pipeline infrastructure. So think your cast iron, your bare steel replacement programs. Many utilities around this time were able to work with their commissions to establish, rate recovery procedures specific to main replacement programs. And that, announcement is really what drove that process. So fast forward again, 2018, those incidents occurred. And then in 2020, the Leonel Rondon Pipeline Safety Act is enacted as part of the Pipes Act of 2020. That was really the legislation that set the stage for this notice of proposed rulemaking. That additional requirements were going to be coming into place to prevent an incident like that from happening again. And then in 2021, kind of peripherally related, the bipartisan infrastructure law, which most folks have heard about, established PHMSA's first ever grant program. So the Distribution Infrastructure Safety and Modernization Program that many municipal gas utilities are participating in to provide funding to accelerate replacement of infrastructure as well. So kind of a common theme you're going to see within this rule is that there's definitely a focus on improving safety and improving procedures to prevent an incident like Merrimack Valley from happening again. But at the same time, they do not, PHMSA does not want to slow down replacement efforts, replacement of problematic infrastructure. So putting additional measures in place without adding significant barriers to keep the work going. And there's a little bit of a challenge there sometimes preserving both of those objectives. So just to look at the overview of the changes, we'll start kind of going through these at a high level and then in a little bit more detail for each one. DIMP is certainly a big piece of this, so enhancements to that, really clarifying what some of those expectations are. Some of the things that may have been left a little bit more loosely to the operators to define are now being nailed down a little bit more clearly and concisely. So, certainly one of those is consideration of age as a risk factor, harkening back to that Dallas incident, and then specific consideration of overpressurization as a threat. So that's your Merrimack Valley incident there, as well as consideration of abnormal operating conditions and low probability events. So not just dismissing something that might be a low probability, but could have a very high impact. Also emergency response plan updates. So making sure there's timely coordination with emergency responders, the public, customers, and potential consideration of an incident command system. Operation and maintenance manual updates. So, you'll see in this rule a lot of procedure updates, making sure utilities have in writing what they're going to do to respond to overpressurization and other threats. Also implementing maintenance of change or MOC procedures. Continuing with the overview, integration of traceable, verifiable, and complete records that are critical to maintaining proper pressure controls. We'll talk more about that. Inspection and monitoring requirements, so monitoring of pressure at stations during construction, some clarification of inspection requirements, and then another big one, upgrades to district regulator stations to prevent overpressurization. So some new requirements coming into place here with 2 separate types of overpressure protection, or if that's not feasible, putting in place and defining alternative preventative and mitigative measures and what those might look like. There are a few smaller updates that have been made as part of this as well, some clarification of test record requirements and things of that nature that PHMSA has incorporated into this rulemaking. So that is kind of the overview. As we dive in a little bit more to each of these topics, we'll start with DIMP, right? DIMP enhancements, and that's 192.1007B, starting with identification of threats. So this is kind of the first step in your DIMP process, identifying potential threats to your system. And what PHMSA is really looking for you to do here is, look at specific material types with known issues explicitly identifying overpressurization as a threat to low pressure systems, including extreme weather and geohazards as subcategories within natural forces, and also adding an explicit requirement to consider the age of the system, piping, and components in identifying threats. So the key ones there, the overpressurization and the age of the system, that operators may have considered those on their own volition previously, but PHMSA is now saying these are things that you must specifically consider when you're identifying threats. From there, going into the next step, evaluating and ranking risks. So that's 192.1007C. Evaluating risks that result from pipelines constructed with certain materials. Those are potentially more risk-prone materials. Evaluation of risks, from an overpressure event, specifically that could result in gas burning equipment seeing higher pressures than they might expect. And then some other ones here that, consideration of risks, even if the operator has yet to experience that risk on your system. It's no longer acceptable to say that, we've never seen that happen. We don't anticipate that happening. PHMSA is really looking for operators to say that, even these low probability events, you cannot say that those would have no potential consequences unless you're able to provide a very detailed engineering analysis to PHMSA stating why you don't see those low probability events as an issue. So really putting the onus on the utility to justify why something may not be considered as part of your DIMP plan. Again, a lot of documentation type requirements included in this rule as well. As we move on to the next phase here, so you've identified your risks, you've ranked and evaluated your risks, then you're looking to identify and implement measures to address those risks. That's 100.07D. So this is where some of that traceable, verifiable, and complete record requirement comes in. So looking at those for the pressure controls on your system, and then confirming, as we'll talk about here in a little bit, that each of your district regulator stations meets the new design standards for additional overpressure protection, or if you're not able to do that for some reason, that you've specifically identified what preventative and mitigative measures you're going to take to meet that need instead, and that will require a specific notification to PHMSA. That kind of a summary there of the new DIMP requirements as we move into emergency response, and that's 192.615. There were a lot of challenges. I encourage you to kind of read through that NTSB report again for Merrimack Valley, but not only the incident itself occurring, but how communication was made with first responders, the general public, customers, or maybe more accurately, the lack thereof of communication that There's a significant amount of time that passed from the incident first occurring to when more coordination and communication occurred, and ultimately probably resulted in a lot more folks being put under an evacuation order. Remember, there about 50,000 people that were under that evacuation than probably needed to be if communication had occurred a little bit more efficiently and promptly. So that's really what PHMSA is after here is some of these notifications. Operators may be familiar with the valve rule that was previously published that requires them to notify what they call public safety answering points, or PSAPs, the event of a gas pipeline emergency. But what this rule is looking to do is kind of clarify what some of those emergencies may be. So notifying of potential ruptures, notifying of a release of gas that results in one or more fatalities, or PHMSA likes to put this kind of blanket language in there, any other emergency deemed significant by the operator. So putting some onus on the utility there to determine what that might be. They have tried to clarify a little bit, what an event might look like to undertake what they are quoting prompt and effective response for notification of an unintentional release of gas and shutdown of either 50 or more customers, or if you're an operator with fewer than 100 customers, 50% of those customers. And, we'll put a pin in that, come back to it. There has been some industry discussion on what that number should be, some comments on that, but that is what PHMSA has proposed here. And then again, coming back to written procedures, looking for operators to establish a written procedure for notifying PSAPs or other coordinating agencies, and clarifying that what they mean by immediate is that communication should occur within 15 minutes following initial notification to the operator of an emergency. So pretty quick response that PHMSA is looking for as part of this rule. So that's for first responders and emergency officials. They've also included some provisions around notification to the general public. At this point, there are not any federal regulations that require operators to establish communication with the public during a pipeline emergency. This would change that. So they're looking for operators to put those procedures in place to communicate with the public as soon as practicable during a gas pipeline emergency. So when it first occurs, then also continuing communication through service restoration and recovery efforts through one or more channels. Another common theme with all of these notifications is that they must be delivered both in English and in other languages that are commonly understood by a significant portion of your service territory. So need to make sure those messages are reaching folks in the languages that they speak. So, again, emergency officials, general public, and then specifically for utility customers or gas customers, there's not a federal regulation right now requiring a kind of established communication system with those customers. But what PHMSA is asking here is that utilities implement a voluntary, for the customer that is, opt-in customer notification system for communication during a gas pipeline emergency. So thinking, text messages, emails, other types of notifications similar to that, periodic testing of that system, and again, written procedures on how that would be accessible to both English speaking and non-English speaking folks. The final piece of the emergency response is the potential for requirement of incident command systems, or ICS. This is not specifically required in the rulemaking as it stands today, but they are requesting comments on this. And an ICS is effectively a standard approach to command, control, and coordination for on-scene management of emergencies or other incidents. So again, thinking, written procedures, established protocols, clear chains of command. An example of that is the National Incident Management System, or NIMS, that's used by a lot of federal agencies. So they're seeking comment from gas utilities on this right now. This may or may not be included in the final rule, but again, PHMSA's intent here was to address some of the issues from that Merrimack Valley incident where communication was a significant challenge and probably complicated matters to a pretty significant degree. So from there, looking at O&M updates, again, a heavy focus on procedures and documentation as part of this rule, and this is 192.605. So updating your O&M manual to include specific provisions for overpressurization, both investigating, when these issues occur, documenting ahead of time what specific actions and events personnel must follow, and establishing clear statements of authority for relevant personnel so that everybody knows what they're responsible for, what they're able to do before one of these events happens. Also developing procedures to investigate and correct the cause of one of those overpressurization events if it occurs. Looking for that language specific to overpressurization, and then also adding some requirements for management of change, or MOC. There's no requirement for this for distribution operators at this point. This is something that has been worked into the transmission pipeline requirements. So if you work on that side, that's something you may be familiar with. But this is going to be required for distribution operators going forward to include a detailed maintenance of change process in their O&M manual. And this, in PHMSA's words, should apply to any time you're changing things relevant to technology, equipment, procedures, organizational changes, basically anything that could impact the integrity or safety of your gas distribution system. And they provide some examples, things for consideration. So, installing or modifying new pressure control devices, monitoring devices, overpressure protection devices. If you were modifying your alarm set points in your SCADA system, if you're introducing new OPP technologies that you have not used previously, maybe you're revising your standard operating procedures for design or construction, maintenance, etc. Or again, blanket language from PHMSA here, other changes that may impact the integrity or safety of your gas distribution system. So possibly a pretty wide net there. As part of management of change as well, PHMSA is instituting some requirements that, quote unquote, qualified personnel must review and certify any construction plans associated with installations, modifications, replacements, or upgrades. And those qualified personnel should be qualified under subpart N of Part 192. PHMSA is saying, that could include an engineer with a PE license, could include a subject matter expert per se, or any other employee who possesses the necessary knowledge. The NTSB, as part of their recommendation for Merrimack Valley and other incidents, is called on states to require that all future gas infrastructure projects require licensed professional engineer approval and stamping. Of course, the NTSB investigates these incidents when they occur. They don't have the regulatory authority over utilities. That's what PHMSA is responsible for. So PHMSA has certainly taken that NTSB regulation, or recommendation, I should say, into account. But also, again, kind of balancing, like I mentioned before, that PHMSA knows that utilities have challenges with the availability of professional engineer resources, that could cause delays in the remediation of integrity issues. So if those resources aren't available to do the reviews, and the work in the field grinds to a halt as a result, that's maybe not in everybody's best interest either, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure these problematic items are getting replaced. So that's where PHMSA has tried to take some middle ground here, that there's a couple of options for who that qualified personnel may be. That is certainly a continued topic of industry discussion of what that definition is going to look like. PHMSA has requested comments, relative back to maintenance of change for adoption of ASME standard B31.8S, which again is associated with transmission piping, if that would make sense to incorporate for the distribution arena, or if the management of change should just kind of take a different process. So that is kind of ongoing as well. All right, so as we move into traceable, verifiable, and complete records, this is 192.638 being updated here. Again, operators must maintain those TBC records, specifically documenting the characteristics of the pipeline critical to ensuring proper pressure controls. So this is a little bit different maybe than the transmission TBC requirements that some of us are familiar with. that kind of encompass everything related to the system. This is really focused on, things that are essential to pressure control. And they give some examples, things like, location, maps, drawings, schematics for regulators, valves, and underground piping. Definitely including those control lines, as mentioned from the Merrimack Valley incident. Attributes of those regulators or control valves, things like the set points, the design capacity, the valve failure position, the configuration of overpressure protection, kind of how things are arranged, working in parallel, working in series, what the design process is behind that. Or again, another kind of broad stroke there, other records deemed critical by the operator. So relying somewhat on the operators to determine what needs to be collected and maintained there. They state, certainly that if you don't have those TVC records, a plan must be developed to collect those records, which may sound easier than it is in reality. That an operator must also collect those records on an opportunistic basis. So there are provisions, certainly in the code for that already when, exposed piping reports, things of that nature, but integrating that into this process as well. And another key piece of this is that PHMSA is saying that those required records, you don't just have to collect them, you must keep them accessible and organized to where personnel that are performing or overseeing, certain tasks can easily find them and utilize them, because those records are of no use to anybody if they're not accessible. So another thing that they're saying here is that, once one of those records is collected, that operators must keep it for the life of the pipeline. That's certainly something that's being discussed as part of the comments as well. All right, so as we get into some of the inspection and monitoring requirements, this is 192.640 and 192.605. There are not any requirements right now for operators to have procedures for monitoring gas pressure with qualified personnel or having a remote capability to shut off the flow of gas. So you can imagine how this could have been relevant in the Merrimack Valley incident if proper monitoring was taking place, noticing that pressure was exceeding where it should have been, having somebody there on site to quickly close emergency valves or have the opportunity to do an emergency shut off could definitely have prevented that event from occurring. So as part of that, PHMSA is issuing a new requirement here for those qualified personnel to be on site, to monitor pressure, and have the capability to shut off the flow of gas during an overpressurization event. This does not apply if an operator already has the ability to remotely monitor pressure and remotely or automatically shut off the system. So if you have some kind of provision to do a shut off already, you do not necessarily have to have personnel on site. Again, those personnel must be qualified under subpart N, and of course, written procedures are required for implementing these monitoring requirements. A smaller inspection provision, something that's kind of been around for a while. There's concerns from small operators about existing requirements for personnel other than those who completed the construction task to conduct the inspection. So an exception has been added for gas distribution mains for small gas distribution operators as part of this rule that basically allows personnel who were involved in the same construction task, they can inspect each other's work when the operator could otherwise have only complied if they used the third-party inspector. So this is really intended for small operators that don't have a lot of internal staff, maybe don't have the financial resources to employ third-party inspection, but to do this, justification has to be documented and retained for the life of the pipeline. And certainly PHMSA would evaluate whether that justification is reasonable or not. So something for smaller operators to consider and something that has been clarified or will be clarified as part of this rule. Continuing, so test records 192.517 and 192.725. Right now, there are a couple of categories of tests. So, pipelines operating below 100 PSI, service lines, and plastic pipelines that are only required to retain records for those tests for 5 years. PHMSA is proposing here that now those tests must be kept for the life of the pipeline. So it's a somewhat significant change there. More minor change for 192.725 that for reinstatement of service lines, some clarifying language that those service lines must be tested in accordance with subpart J of this part. So just making it clear that those reinstated service lines have to be tested effectively to the same requirements that all other pipe components are tested to. Then we get to potentially the big one here with the station OPP and overpressure protection. So this is 192, 195, and 192.741. And there are effectively 3 new requirements that are coming in for district regulator stations that serve a low pressure distribution system. I think that's some important language to pay attention to as far as how PHMSA defines a district regulator station as part of this rule. Serving a low pressure system to see, how many stations would actually fall under this requirement. But that first rule, the big one, is that those district stations must now consist of at least 2 different methods of overpressure protection. So that could be relief valve, it could be monitoring regulator, could be an automatic shutoff valve, but it is no longer sufficient in this case to just have a working regulator and a monitoring regulator of the same type. Vis-a-vis the incident in Merrimack Valley, that was the configuration. There was a working regulator and a monitoring regulator. Both of those had downstream control lines. Both of those experienced the same issue and failed to operate properly. So in that case, the backup system really did not provide the level of protection that was intended as part of that design. So this requirement to have those 2 methods of overpressure protection will apply to any stations that are new, replaced, relocated, or otherwise changed. And for all other systems, you either have to meet the new requirements, if you're not touching these systems, or identify and notify PHMSA of alternative and mitigative measures of specifically what you're going to do to avoid the need to replace those components. The second requirement that's part of this rule is that each district regulator station serving a low pressure system must minimize the risk of overpressurization that could be caused by any single event that either immediately or over time affects the safe operation of more than one overpressure protection device. So there's a few examples that PHMSA gives here. It could be hydrostatic testing upstream that results in moisture freezing concerns. Could be construction work upstream and metal shaving concerns. Could be oil hydrates or high sulfides entering the system. Could be those damage to control lines that we discussed. So, a few specific considerations there. And then the third new requirement is for remote monitoring of gas pressure required at or near the location of overpressure protection devices. So the current telemetering requirements do not require any active monitoring. So what they'd be looking to do here is making sure that you have an active monitoring system for pressure at your overpressure protection devices. These 3 new requirements, along with most of the requirements in the rule, will require operators to be in compliance within 1 year of publication of the final rule, which could be a pretty quick time frame specifically to these OPP devices. So the question is, what happens now, right? So where do we go from here? That's kind of the summary of all the provisions, but what happens next? So this NPRM, obviously not an official rulemaking yet, but was published in the Federal Register for everybody to review on September 7th of this year. AGA, APGA, and NGA have been working on joint industry comments. Those were submitted on November 6th, so a little bit ago. Those are currently being reviewed by PHMSA. Just a quick summary of some of those comments from AGA and some of the things that operators are concerned with. They have some challenges with that provision of age of pipe, particularly evaluating that. Some operators' position is that age is itself not a standalone threat, so not necessarily something that can be considered in a vacuum. Also, provision for looking at that number of customers required for notification. In the rule right now, that number is 50 or 50% of your customers if you have 100 or less. AGA has suggested to increase that to 270 customers as the threshold. The maintenance of change process that we discussed, AGA has suggested maybe exempting some considerations from that. So like kind replacements or routine O&M, making sure that those don't necessarily have to be part of the MOC process. Looking at the qualified personnel, what that means for review of construction plans as part of that MOC process, that maybe signature certification could be sufficient for that, and that specific operator qualification may not be required there. So kind of seeking some clarification from PHMSA on that. The test record piece that we mentioned, PHMSA's position there is that those should now be retained for the life of the pipeline. AGA has requested that that be reduced to 10 years, so basically double what it is right now at 5 years, and then also reducing the requirements there to be just the segment tested, the date, and the test pressure. So those are some of the kind of more minor comments from AGA. The big one is around the district regulator station upgrades that we were discussing, and kind of defining a little bit better what those quote alternative and mitigative measures might be, providing some pathways, similar to transmission mega rule, a couple of different paths to compliance, rather than just the need to replace all these components wholesale. Also extending the time frame for upgrades to these stations. So if you remember, that rule was stating that as it's written now, compliance would need to occur within a year of publication of the final rule. This, AGA's comment would suggest 10 years for compliance, or 15 years for full capacity relief or slam shut situations. So significantly longer time frame. But if you look below, you can see why AGA is requesting that. There's a couple of columns here, basically estimates of the number of stations serving low pressure systems. That's that first column. The number of stations serving low pressure that do not meet the current requirements, so that don't have that second level of overpressure protection that would now be required. And then PHMSA's estimate of the cost to upgrade a station with that second level of overpressure protection. And then in the second row there, you can see what AGA's estimates are. The number of stations that, 5 times order of magnitude greater than what PHMSA was estimating. And from a cost perspective, you can see PHMSA's number there, which may be a little bit eyebrow raising on the low side. AGA is kind of estimating more realistic numbers there, if on the order of $50,000 to $175,000 per station. So significant time impact, a significant dollar impact specifically to comply with this requirement that I think operators are seeking some resolution on to maybe find a more realistic path forward. But really where we expect this rule to go next, that comment period is still ongoing right now. There may be some more back and forth that occurs between AGA, APGA, NGA, and PHMSA on all of those rulemaking considerations. But the current expectation right now is that this final rule would be potentially published at the end of 2024 or sometime in early 2025, which as we get ready to move into 2024 is not that far away now. So I think really the impetus on operators is to be getting familiar with these rules, getting some plans in place to deal with them. Certainly, as mentioned, a lot of these considerations will require compliance within a year of whenever the rule is published. So if that rule, comes out in December of 2024, PHMSA's expectation that a lot of these things will be in place by December of 25, which really does not leave a lot of time. So good idea for operators to be looking at that now, sooner than later. But really appreciate everybody's time today. I hope that this was a good introduction, at least, to where we expect this rule to be going and kind of what the major provisions are. certainly interested in discussing this further with utility operators and, how you guys see the big concerns of this, what you expect to be the most major impacts, changes or considerations that you're looking at as part of this. Certainly we want to be part of the solution, working with the industry as a whole here to remember that the end goal here is to always be increasing the safety of our gas pipeline distribution system, preventing incidents like Merrimack Valley from occurring, but also finding, efficient and feasible ways of putting procedures like this in place. So certainly appreciate the opportunity to be part of that discussion here with everybody. But with that, just looking to see if we have any comments in the chat here. It does not look like we do. Yeah, if there's no other comments from anybody on the call here, just want to say thank you again for everybody's participation, and look forward to further discussion on this. This is certainly something that Pond will stay engaged on in the years ahead here, and working with all of our utility partners to comply with these requirements. But thank you all very much for your time. Hope everyone has a happy holiday, and we look forward to talking again soon.